What's up, everybody, and welcome to the Fantasy Flex podcast. I am your host, Chris Raybon, joined by Samantha Previte, and today we're going to be talking all about running backs. We're going to go through ADP, kind of who's overvalued, who's undervalued. We'll do it each of the next 4 weeks. We'll go through wide receivers, tight ends, and then quarterbacks leading up to the draft. We'll also touch on any type of news items that you need to know that you may have missed. So we'll hop right into it. But Samantha, what's going on?
I'm doing great, Chris. Kind of happy in a way that things have been calming down a bit in terms of the news cycle, but we still got some nuggets out there.
Yeah, I mean, for once, like the NFL wasn't like the dominant news for a little while because, Chris Rock went and got slapped by Will Smith. So that kind of overtook, I feel like, whatever was happening in the NFL. But just yesterday, I think it was yesterday, we're recording on Tuesday, and we got word that Bruce Arians is going to step down as the Tampa Bay Buccaneers head coach. So it looks like Todd Bowles is going to take over for him. Arians is going to go to the front office. And Samantha, I just wondered if you had any quick kind of fantasy takes on this. From my perspective, I just thought, we heard some whispers, right? Like that Brady may have not been happy with Arians and the offense. So the only thing I can really think of is that we might see more of that Brady New England offense and less of those, kind of deep focused offense that we saw the last couple of years.
Yeah, it was certainly surprising, though. Arians has been dealing with health issues for the past couple of years. So and it was a cool sort of transition that he handed it off to Todd Bowles, who will get a second chance here. He was 26-41 over his 5 seasons. That was 3 games with Miami and the rest of them with the Jets. Can't say that he was surrounded by too much talent. So it's really hard to say what we think he's going to really look like in terms of a coach, with such an all-star cast behind him. I mean, Tampa stacked on both sides of the ball. So I think it'll be interesting because you could argue that it'll be a more defensive minded sort of coaching situation from him coming from that DC role. But we've seen Brady thrive in a more defensive minded sort of coaching thing from Bill Belichick for years. So I don't think it'll change too much. I mean, maybe Brady gets a little bit more of an influence in this offense, as you mentioned. Yeah, those rumors about him going to Miami, maybe that kind of gets a little bit stymied at this point, though.
Yeah, I think it kind of reminds me of, like you said, Belichick. And, while Belichick was a little more hands-on with the offense, I think now it's like at this point, Brady can do that. Byron Leftwich is still there. So, he was kind of, people thought maybe he's going to get a head coaching job or something like that, but he's still there. And I think that those two guys are going to kind of really be the offense this year. And it's, I think Bowles is going to kind of stay out of the way. So at the end of the day, I think this is more desirable for Brady. And I did hear whispers that, Brady, again, wasn't happy completely with Arians and his influence. And, Arians would kind of shade Brady in the media. I know you remember some of those, every time he would throw a pick or, just make a mistake, he would kind of get called out by Arians. So if anything, I think this is a positive for Brady. I mean, he didn't look washed up at all last year. So I think it's more of the same. I think it's great news for a guy like Mike Evans, who should just be a complete monster this year with Godwin starting the year out most likely. And then AB no longer there. So Brady, Evans, and Fournette, who we'll talk about in a bit. I think it's good news for them. Let's move on to I'll just update you guys. We don't really need to talk about it since there's not much to say here, but apparently Desean Watson is not out of the clear yet. Adam Schefter reported the NFL could still discipline him. No timetable on that discipline, but just something to keep in mind. If you're drafting this time of year, that Watson's not guaranteed to play a full season or even partial part of the season. So I'm still kind of up in the air, but moving on to this next one, Samantha, and I did want to get your thoughts on this real quick. Andy Dalton signed with the Saints. Taysom Hill is going to be moved to tight end officially. Dalton says he does not expect to challenge Winston for the starting role. But nevertheless, we've seen Jameis Winston kind of play himself into getting benched. Do you think Dalton makes starts this year for the Saints?
I don't think so, because I think the Jameis Winston that we saw at like in New Orleans was very different than the Jameis Winston that we were used to in Tampa Bay. So he did play much more conservatively, and we didn't see that turnover interceptions trend like we had seen previously. Obviously, good news for fantasy managers that we don't really have to deal with like this whole Taysom Hill thing. But I mean, it does maybe signify that he could be on a bit of a short leash if, Andy Dalton is a high quality backup, I think. So they could turn to him at some point. There's a lot of kind of moving pieces here with a lot of changes in this whole front office and everything. So we shall see. I want to see Jameis Winston do well in this league, and I think that he would be probably more beneficial for the skill players on the team. So I'm rooting for him to play all 17 games.
Yeah, he's definitely an entertaining player. Although last year he became kind of the opposite of an entertaining player. He averages 167 passing yards per game, and that's why I think Dalton makes at least one start. Like I would put the over under at like 1.5, just because I think Winston, he was very good and very efficient in his role, but they also had to play kind of this very conservative, like we're going to pass for under 200 yards a game type of offense. And I think at some point during a year that can get old, especially if your defense has a couple of bad games and you end up losing or defense has average games and you end up losing games like 20-10 or 24-3 or something like that. It's like, well, if you just scored some points, maybe you'd had a better chance. So I do think Dalton makes starts this year, but I agree. I think Winston played a lot better than people realized last year, and he cut down on his main issue. We just have to see if he can kind of do that now in a higher volume pass offense. Because I think with Michael Thomas back, you're not just going to want to throw the ball, 25 to 30 times a game. Another quick one, Bobby Wagner to the Rams. They just keep kind of hiring these guns. They were one of the tougher running back matchups last year, right outside the top 10 in terms of most difficult. So I think that'll continue. Another piece of news, Ronald Jones goes to the Kansas City Chiefs. And Samantha, what do you think this means for Clyde Edwards-Helaire out there in Kansas City? They never seem to give him that full featured workload.
Yeah, definitely. And even, looking at the full picture here, he did miss 7 games last year due to injury. So he's never really had that full breakout that we were hoping for. I mean, he was obviously highly drafted and maybe didn't live up to the actual hype. I thought he would be like a post-hype type sleeper last year and didn't really live up to it because of limitations in his role and also the injuries. Jones is 1 year removed from an 1,100 scrimmage yard season. He finished as RB 16 in half PPR in 2020. So I think that he could definitely siphon away carries, especially if the Chiefs are worried about durability long-term for Clyde Edwards-Helaire.
Yeah, this is very scary for CEH, especially if you own him in something like Dynasty or something like that. Because I just think, it's one thing to have like Daryl Williams and those guys, Derek Gore, Jerick McKinnon, these kind of reclamation projects are more replacement level players, but Jones is a little bit of a step up from that. And he's a lot better in a situation that could really frustrate fantasy managers, which is inside the 10-yard line. In his career, he's converted 41% of his 42 carries inside the 10 into touchdowns. Edwards-Helaire is at just 27%. So that could be a massive difference. And also Edwards-Helaire dropped off from year 1 to year 2 in terms of his yards after contact. It went from 3.0 to 2.5, and his missed tackle percentage went from 20% to 14% in terms of missed tackles forced. So, so they do say that running backs' best years often their rookie years. And you mentioned the injuries, Samantha. So I think stock down definitely for Edwards-Helaire. One more, I think a little less impactful in terms of how things shake out, but somewhat notable nonetheless. Boston Scott re-signed with the Eagles. So this, Miles Sanders, I don't know. What do you think, Samantha? I mean, Miles Sanders right now, he's got to be penciled in as the starter. He's going as the running back 35 in Underdog's ADP for best ball leagues right now, going outside the top 100 overall. What do you think of Sanders here with the Scott signing? Gainwell obviously still there as well.
Yeah, Sanders was an avoid for me last year, and he's kind of in that range right now. I mean, he did have maybe Jordan Howard last year too. It was a pretty messy situation, especially with Gainwell, who I thought was going to be a little bit better. He ended up kind of not playing a huge role, but Sanders had 0 touchdowns last year and just 3 games with more than 8 fantasy points in half PPR. So, like I said, I think I'm probably putting him in that avoid range. I think where he's going in that ADP, like low end RB3 is probably where I would maybe consider him, but like I wouldn't feel good about really having him at this point. Like I said, I think this is not necessarily a huge impact on Sanders from year over year. And things could certainly change if he really can stay healthy and take over this backfield. And there's also some question marks if Jalen Hurts makes it through this whole season, which I think would impact sort of his role in that offense.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the touchdowns, and Miles Sanders broke our app. So first of all, everyone go download the Action Network app. It's great. You can track all your bets, including your futures. So he broke our app because I had about maybe 20 to 30 NFL futures that I bet before the season. And we usually wait till the year's over. So after the Super Bowl, they all get graded, whether it's winning total or, player props for season long stats or whatever. And all my props got graded. All my futures got graded, except one that's still sitting there, which is Miles Sanders under 7.5 touchdowns. And I think it's just because he had 0 touchdowns. It like broke our app. We just weren't ready for Miles Sanders not even to score 1 touchdown. And this has been an issue for him. His entire career, he averages a touchdown every 48.7 touches for his career. And we're talking about a sample size of nearly 600 touches. So he's a very talented player, but I think the franchise kind of views him as more of a 1A leader of a committee backfield than a guy that you want to give a ton of touches to. His touches have dropped every year from 229 in year 1 to 192 last year, 192 in year 2 to 163 last year, excuse me. So Miles Sanders probably getting drafted where he should be, even a little high. I don't think the Scott signing impacts him too much, but not a sexy fantasy choice for 2022. But let's go right into some undervalued and overvalued running backs for this year. And Samantha, I'll start with you. Give me a running back who you think is undervalued.
Yeah, I don't think he's too undervalued, but I'm going to start with David Montgomery, who is going at RB16 according to Underdog. The Bears were definitely one of the weakest offensive teams last year. They averaged just 18.3 points per game, which ranked sixth worst in the NFL. But weeks 13 through 18, Montgomery was the RB3. He averaged 15.5 fantasy points and half PPR. In 13 games, he had 5 games with 18 or more fantasy points. So he had some pretty big explosions. And I think that I'm still a Justin Fields believer. I know I was out here making videos with you last year at this time, talking about how I believed in Justin Fields. I hope that he makes this kind of year 2 leap. And I think that that'll really increase David Montgomery's upside. But, I think that he certainly has RB1 upside if he can stay healthy and kind of if this offense can get a little better than where it was last year.
Yeah, even last year in what seemed like somewhat of a quiet year, he was still RB14 in points per game. So not far off from RB1 status. And, he's still going even below what that was. And I think he could only improve this year. I know Khalil Herbert was drafted, but it's a new regime now in Chicago. So I don't think the Herbert, that kind of him sitting behind him on the depth chart really means too much. We'll get to some more from you. I'll throw one in here in the meantime, and that's Leonard Fournette, RB25, way too low for Fournette. We just mentioned that Ronald Jones is no longer in Tampa Bay. That was Fournette's kind of main competition for work most of these last couple of years. And then you do have Keyshawn Vaughn there, but Fournette's just been so good. I mean, he essentially got back to that kind of place that we thought he initially was when he was with the Jaguars, when he was just one of those running backs that we kind of compared to Zeke a little bit. Like, okay, this is a guy that was drafted highly that is expected to kind of come in here and just carry the load. He never really got it together in Jacksonville, but he was the RB7 in half PPR points per game last year. And, now he's got even less competition, I think, with just Keyshawn Vaughn to spell him. So love Fournette, as, a guy you can get outside the top 24 right now that should finish as a top 10 running back with Brady back. And, the ADP is kind of still adjusting to that with Brady unretiring. But I think you got to capitalize on that where you can.
I totally agree. He's definitely a guy that I was shocked to see outside the top 24. I mean, I definitely think he has a very strong chance of finishing as a top 12 running back, especially with sort of fewer mouths to feed all around. You mentioned Antonio Brown and you mentioned Ronald Jones and possibly starting the season without Chris Godwin. So I really like this one. And I just really like seeing that he's kind of picked up that traction in the playoffs and really a couple of years ago and really held on to that sort of momentum throughout the year last year.
Reminds me a little of Aaron Jones before AJ Dillon became like a huge factor, like just like a guy with a really good quarterback and a good offense that, is a little bit underrated here. So love Fournette. Who you got next? Who's undervalued? Who else is undervalued?
Yeah. So the next guy I have is Devin Singletary at RB24. So he definitely had a lackluster start to the year because he had that kind of odd committee going on with Zach Moss. Weeks 1 through 13, he was RB39, but then was the RB2 in the final 5 games down the stretch behind only Rashad Penny. He had 6 touchdowns over those 5 games. Zach Moss is still on the roster, but he's like a bum at this point. I think it was very clear that Singletary, that was his job. And they did sign Duke Johnson. I could see Johnson taking over some of the passing downs work as he has in previous roles, but he's not a guy that I'm really going to be super concerned about. So if you're getting Singletary at RB24, I feel pretty good about that.
Yeah, I got an idea for like Zach Moss. We should get like a little NFL viewing room every Sunday, and Zach Moss and Trey Sermon could just like go there and watch games since they'll probably be scratches on game day anyway. There's no point, dressing up and coming to the sideline.
Add Kenny Gainwell there too.
Right. Yeah. Oh man, that was what a nightmare last year. So yeah, some of the, rookies, running backs tend to be profitable, but as we kind of talked about, between Sermon and Gainwell, and I know Moss was in, year 2, but they don't always pan out. But yeah, Singletary, I like it. I think that he's a guy that they kind of figured out that's how their offense works best, with him carrying the load. And it's weird because that they figured that out. I feel like his first year too, like down the stretch, they had Frank Gore, I believe it was, and they just stopped using him and gave Singletary the work, and their offense improved then too. So I don't know why they keep going away from him. It seems like maybe they'll figure it out this time around. Dable obviously no longer there. So there is a little bit of uncertainty, but that's why you're buying low. Another guy I like is, and I'll just group these two together since they played on the same team last year. James Conner, RB29, and then Chase Edmonds, RB39 in ADP at Underdog right now. Conner I love because Edmonds is in Miami. So Conner was a top 5 running back in weeks 10 to 14 without Edmonds. He was also the running back 5 on the season, even though Edmonds played 12 games. And then Conner got a 3-year, $21 million contract, $13.5 million guaranteed. So that's no slouch of a running back contract. The Cardinals clearly drew their line in the sand between, who they preferred and who they wanted to give the bigger workload by giving one, over 13 mil guaranteed and letting the other one go. So love Conner in Arizona. Still a strong offense, still an up-tempo offense. And this guy's just a touchdown machine. And then Edmonds at RB39, I think, we talked a little earlier about Edmonds. I said, if he's kind of being drafted outside that, starting range, I think there is some value there, whether it's flex, whether it's low into RB2, because I fully expect him to kind of take that lead role in the Miami backfield, at least in terms of touches. He averaged 5.67 yards per touch over the last 3 seasons. That is 6th of 54 running backs with a minimum of 300 touches. So he's been one of the most effective backs in the league. And he averaged a career high 13.3 touches per game last year, which kind of went under the radar because Conner was having such a good season and generally stole the touchdowns. But this is a new team. It's here with a new coach, and just kind of everything's new all around. So we can't just look at the roster and say, okay, Edmonds definitely not going to get touchdowns. Raheem Mostert, just another guy on that roster, hasn't really ever stayed healthy. Obviously, all the other holdovers who may be back, Gaskin and whatnot, they're not really enamored with them, which is why they went out and signed 2 more backs from, McDaniel's last head coaching stop. So I think both Connor and Edmonds have a lot of value that early drafters still aren't quite realizing yet.
Yeah, totally. I mean, on the Cardinals depth chart after Connor, it is, Benjamin, Jonathan Ward, and Jalen Samuels. Not even sure that all 3 of those guys will make the roster. But yeah, I mean, that's certainly not a lot of competition. And he had that ridiculous year in terms of touchdowns. So they clearly like to use him on the goal line and in those situations, which are going to be really advantageous for fantasy managers. So I really like that one. Edmonds, we talked about sort of previously, I think on the last episode where we were just kind of talking about that backfield being crowded. Now, yeah, that certainly limits his upside, but at RB39, you're getting pretty good value for that guy who is certainly very talented. All right, the final one that I have here is Daryl Henderson at RB44. So he was RB 21.5 PPR on a per game basis last year. Obviously, that was without Cam Akers, who was injured during the preseason. That was a really serious injury, though. And yes, like he benefits, quote unquote, from being injured early. But that said, it's a major injury. It's an Achilles injury that could certainly hurt his like burst and speed as a running back. We also don't just really know to expect. I feel like he could just come out of the gate sort of slow. So, I mean, there are kind of question marks there. And Henderson is talented. So I think at RB44, like you're not starting him, but he's a guy that you could keep on your bench, especially if Akers can't stay healthy throughout the season.
Yeah, like what is your read on Akers' health? Because I think this kind of, I mean, given the fact that you do like Henderson as a value, I'm guessing that you are somewhat concerned about Akers' health because, we talked about it all, leading up to the Super Bowl that this guy, Cam Akers, he had like that one highlight on the trick play with Odell, but I mean, he struggled tremendously. He had 72 carries, including the postseason, 72 carries for 175 yards and no rushing touchdowns. That's 2.29 yards per carry. So, I mean, that's low. And like, what is that? That's Kalen Ballage from a couple years ago kind of futility. So is that something that's kind of concerning you here that he doesn't make that full recovery to year 1 where he had the 4.8 yards per carry?
Yeah, I'm certainly a little concerned. I think that it's really hard not being a physician, not being able to rank injury severity, of course, but like I would worry about his type of injury long-term, maybe more than an ACL. Not that I think that even an ACL is that great, especially for a long-term type running back situation when they are just inherently more prone to sort of those types of injuries. So, yeah, I would say that I'm even more concerned about him than I would say like a guy like J.K. Dobbins, who I know we're going to talk about later.
Yeah, and that there's kind of a theme here because I think in early ADP, you're seeing some injured guys being kind of overdrafted and the other guy who would benefit kind of being underdrafted. In some situations, you're feeling the reverse. So generally, I just look toward the lower drafted guy. So sometimes you're going to get value one way, sometimes you're going to get it the other way, but that goes right into a guy like James Robinson, who did have a very similar injury to Akers, except he's going at RB42. So you can get Robinson in that Henderson range. Listen, I think with Travis Etienne, who's going as the RB19, remember, he's coming back from an injury too. So it's a huge disparity here. There's a new regime. Etienne was drafted in the first round by the old regime. So, that's clearly kind of a square move. Etienne is a great player, but it's still a square move. We also know that like the franchise quarterback, Trevor Lawrence, vouched for James Robinson, said, he's essentially our best player on offense. So, going forward, the main thing is build around Lawrence and what he needs to be around him to be successful. So I think that Etienne is going to ultimately slot in as a pass catching guy, kind of like a Nyheim Hines. But James Robinson still has like the outside shot of being like the Jonathan Taylor of this offense. Now he is going to probably be out a little longer than Etienne, which could explain the price, but everyone kind of talks about year 1 with Robinson, and year 2, he improved his yards per carry, 4.5 to 4.7. His yards after contact from 3.18 to 3.29. His yards per reception went up from 7 to 7.2. And his yards per touch went up from 4.5 to 5.1. So the only thing that really decreased was his touches from over 20 a game to under 14 a game. So While I do worry a little bit about the efficiency, I just think at RB42, like that's where I want to take this kind of chance on a guy like this, as opposed to a Cam Akers who did not look great, but is going at RB19 right now. So Robinson is a guy that I'll be watching and especially just monitoring to see how he's kind of recovering from his injury. But I just think there's way too big of a disparity between him and Etienne, given that both are coming back off injuries and Robinson still would project for more touches, even if they were kind of splitting it up.
I'm just convinced that these guys with these plain generic names like James Robinson and Tim Patrick are habitually disrespected in ADP. So that's my take on the situation.
Oh man, that might be my brand. Just like regular named guys, common named guys. Cause I love Tim Patrick. You guys thought I was joking when I brought up Patrick when the Broncos signed Russell Wilson, but I legitimately think that Tim Patrick could easily be like not the third wide receiver. Like he could be one of the top two in Denver if things break right, because I think he's shown that he's just as talented as the other guys. He just doesn't have the same pedigree.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
And the other two guys have speckled injury histories at best. So I totally buy into that.
And they've had like some really bad portions of seasons. Like even if, like Judy had that miserable rookie year where him and Drew Lock were never on the same page and he had really bad stats. And Cortland Sutton had that really, really bad year last year where it was just like he became like a punchline. So Tim Patrick has always been kind of consistent, but we digress. We got to get into some overvalued running backs. Samantha, there's quite a few, I think, early on that seem a little overvalued. Who you got?
Yeah, I have a number of guys here. I'm going to start with Christian McCaffrey, who's going to be probably one of the most polarizing players of this offseason. He's just a high risk type guy at this point. Last season we went into this and I was very bullish on Christian McCaffrey. I'll take that L because I looked at the menagerie of his injuries and thought well, they didn't seem like it didn't make it seem like he was an injury prone type guy. It just also seemed like the Panthers were not competitive and he probably could have come back if he were on like the Chiefs at the time. But there's like no point in putting him out there if he's kind of banged up. But at this point now he has played 10 games in the last 2 years. And the Panthers just have a number of struggles. We've got question marks at best at quarterback. Right now we're rolling into the season with Sam Darnold. So that's not the most ideal situation. So that certainly throws like uncertainty and devalues him, I think. And the Panthers also had the second worst offensive line according to PFF last year. So there's a lot of pieces that they need to fix right now. They are not close. I think they're like plus 10,000 to win the division this year. So as much as it hurts me as a Panthers fan, I do think he's overvalued at RP2. I would feel more comfortable taking him at like RB5.
Oh, it took a little over 20 minutes, but you gave us an impressive word there with menagerie. So I was waiting for it. But with McCaffrey, it's tough because it's like when he's healthy, he's been that guy. But lately, it's like all that stuff we saw in his first couple of seasons about the durability and everything, that's kind of coming back to haunt him a little bit because now he hasn't managed to stay healthy. And now you look and say, okay, well, do they start to maybe decrease his workload a little bit? I think we saw that at times when he came back last year when, Chuba Hubbard was mixing in a little bit more than maybe he had been previously or anyone really had been previously alongside McCaffrey. So, he's still proven that he can be a top 10 back is in more of like a receiving, not full, full every down back role. But at RB2, you kind of want the max upside here. So I think it's a little early to be going, McCaffrey at 2. But we kind of have to also monitor the camp and see, how are they using him? How do they plan to use him? Because as of right now, I think there's too many question marks. For my first undervalued guy, I'll go J.K. Dobbins. Mentioned him earlier. He's RB17 right now in underdog ADP, and that's just egregious. First of all, we know the Ravens and what they do. They're going to have a committee backfield. So Dobbins' career high touches in a game is 17. His career high carries in a game is 15. Now he's coming off a serious injury. Does that necessarily increase just because he's, now out of his rookie year and now he's really going into year 3, but it's really year 2? I don't know, because he's coming off a serious injury. Him and Gus Edwards are both coming off serious injuries. Both reportedly could start camp on the PUP list. So I think Edwards is the guy who you can get, outside the top 100 in terms of overall ADP. It's just another one where it's like you have two backs coming off injury, just like Etienne and Robinson, and just there's such a disparity between their ADPs here. So, obviously the Ravens will be a run-friendly offense. Dobbins is a very talented back, was never a great receiver, and most people are playing at least half PPR by now. So that's another thing to keep in mind. We just have no idea if he's going to be able to play a full season, if he's going to be back to full strength. And again, these things don't matter as much when you're drafting a guy at RB40. These things matter a lot when you're drafting a guy inside the top 20 or top 24, because then he's essentially you're expecting him to be your starter. And remember, the running back you draft first is likely to miss 2 to 3 games on average. So there's going to be times where Dobbins needs to be your RB1 in your lineup. And I just can't get behind it being drafted here at RB17.
Yeah, I totally agree here. My issue with this is that Dobbins last year going into the season, like before the injury and everything, we didn't have the injury history. We just had sort of this like weird committee in his first season. But a lot of us were convinced that he was going to be the top dog in that committee. But still with that, he was being drafted probably in like the RB20, RB22 range ish going into the season. And like now we're drafting him higher with the injury. And I think that, both guys, there's a good chance, like you said, that they could start on the PUP list. That even if they're healthy for week 1, they start kind of slow. And I don't feel comfortable taking Dobbins nearly that early. Edwards, maybe at like RB 45, which is where he is right now, I would feel a little more comfortable with.
Yeah, I think you're onto something with this names thing. Because J.K. Dobbins is a pretty cool name. And it's like, what's really separating him from James Robinson at this point?
Right?
Both of them could be
Etienne, really cool name.
yeah, exactly. So I think we've cracked the fantasy market. Like this is, now we know exactly how to draft. Like forget all these projections and like comparing it to ADP and this and that. It's like literally just look at guys' names. And fade the guys with the cool names and draft the guys with the generic names. We figured it out.
Absolutely. We'll make a score of that or something like that. So the next guy that I'm going to say that is overvalued, in my opinion, is going to be Johannes Williams. Obviously, fantasy world wants Javonte to be that RB1, and we've definitely seen flickers of him being able to be that rock star. His stock is up with Russell Wilson there, but I think the hype might be too much. He certainly had a lackluster final 3 games of the season, averaged just 39 scrimmage yards per game in that span, while Gordon had 63 scrimmage yards per game in that span. So I think this is really difficult to justify if Melvin Gordon stays, and those talks are still going on. It seems like the front office wants to broker a deal with him. So, I mean, if Gordon's back, I know he's certainly older, but that'll certainly make things messier for him. So at this point, with Gordon's sort of future up in the air, RB7 feels too rich for Javonte.
Yeah, the Denver Post does report that the Broncos are open to bringing Gordon back. I think, Gordon is kind of correctly probably waiting this out on the market, like we saw with the Ravens last year. Teams can lose a starter and even a backup pretty quick. And so, I mean, there could be a chance that Gordon finds a place to start if he kind of hangs on and hangs out for a while and doesn't sign right away. So this might not be resolved anytime soon. I think, just looking at Denver and what they've done in the past, they've been a 2-back system, but this is a new regime. So that's another thing. But Hackett's coming over from Green Bay, where they spent a day 2 pick on AJ Dillon. And then, they had Jamal Williams that first year too. So he's coming from a system where they've always kind of had a 1A and 1B in that system. So it's another thing like Christian McCaffrey. It's like the talent is there, but do we know his workload is getting maximized to be drafting him with a premium first round pick? I just don't know. For Javonte at RB7. So I agree with you. One guy, the last guy I'll talk about, and I don't have to spend long on him because I already kind of mentioned him with Robinson is Travis Etienne. He's going as the RB19, and this just makes no sense. He was drafted by the old regime. He's being treated like a starter when he's more likely to slot into a passing down role. This was, in interviews with new Jaguars head coach Doug Peterson. That's what he kind of said. He said, Etienne, he's a guy that can give us a lot in the passing game, and something we really haven't had in Jacksonville for a while now. So could Etienne maybe have a couple games if Robinson isn't back by week 1 where he's the full-on starter? Yes, but I just can't imagine that he's going to be like this featured back or this top 20 running back in terms of value. I think he's a guy that ideally you'd be drafting him like outside the top 30. And then if he gives you RB19 value, you're very happy. But now you're drafting him at RB19. I just don't see a lot of ceiling there for him to beat that ADP significantly to give you a real edge on your league mates at this ADP.
Yeah, I totally agree. He is definitely a guy that I feel like is going at his ceiling. Another guy that I feel like is going kind of near his ceiling is Saquon Barclay at RB12. He's going a spot ahead of Antonio Gibson and 1 spot behind Nick Chubb, which to me is insane.
That's absurd.
Yeah, and this is only a few spots lower than his ADP was last year. He finished as a top 12 running back in half PPR just 3 times all year, and that was 13 games played. So yeah, he missed some games due to injury. The Giants had the 3rd worst offensive line, according to PFF. They ranked 2nd worst in points per game, 6th worst in time of possession. So this, like I said, just feels more like a ceiling and does not feel safe at this point. I just feel like you are drafting him based on his name.
I don't why do we keep going through this every year with people just like rushing to draft Saquon Barkley? Because it's like, on one hand, yes, his rookie year, he was great. Everybody knows that. But it's like, we're now like, what is it, 3 straight years of people being burned by Saquon Barkley in drafts? Like, who are these people that are still so excited to run out and draft him that he keeps going like a round or 2 or more higher than he should be? Like, I just
a lot of Giants fans out there, I guess.
I'm a Giants fan, and I was like one of the number 1 people saying Saquon is being overdrafted. Like, I was saying that, like, hey, this guy can give you so many bad games. I mean, he's had games where he's had more carries than yards. Like, I don't, and a lot of that is the offensive line. Daboll did say he's going to use him more in the receiving game. Daboll also had Devin Singletary, who, like we mentioned, was kind of up and down in that offense, and his role never really remained consistent for a full season. So I still think there's a lot of red flags. I think there's a lot of explosiveness from Saquon that we saw in year 1 that going into year 5 he just doesn't have anymore. And he's missed 39% of his games over the past 3 years after 352 touches as a rookie. So there's a very good chance that he's just not the same guy anymore. As tough as it is to say, he's still only 25. This will be an age 25 season. But yeah, he's born into BX just like me. I love him. I just can't get behind him at this ADP. Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, no, you're good. I was just going to ask you, speaking of kind of Barkley's rookie year, there are some rookies this year that are popping up pretty high in ADP. Breece Hall, Kenneth Walker, Isaiah Spiller, some of those names that are popping up in the top 35. And I think you think those guys are all a bit overvalued at this early juncture.
Yeah, it just feels a little early. I thought I kind of put those on that list because I saw a theme that Breece Hall at RB22, Walker at RB30, and Isaiah Spiller at RB34 just all seemed a little rich, given that we really don't have a lot of, we don't know where they're landing. And even then, like, there's not a ton of landing spots that I think are going to yield things like Nashi Harris type numbers. If they end up in a committee or something like that, there is a chance that one of them ends up sort of taking over, but there's a lot of question marks, and we could all end up seeing Breece Hall end up being like Trey Sermon or something like that. So there's inherently more question marks with these rookie type guys. Isaiah Spiller especially is someone that I would not really want on my roster at RB34. He is someone that did not strike me as overly athletic based on his combine and pro day numbers. So overall, I just think that this is maybe more of a little bit of rookie hype / recency bias that is inflating these guys' numbers. And I I just think overall this running back class is a little weaker than we've seen in past years.
Yeah, so there's kind of two ways to look at this, because on one hand, I think running backs that are rookies have always been profitable in fantasy to kind of load up on, especially for people that like to go against the grain in higher stakes leagues. The zero running back strategy, rookies fit very well into that. But on the other hand, like you said, you also have to look at the potential landing spots for these guys, and there aren't a ton. I actually think Breece Hall is fairly valued, because you look at him like Javonte Williams last year was the RB16. I think even if Hall lands in a committee, I just think he's so good that he could be a top 5 running back, but he could also be like the RB40. So I think RB22 is fair for him. Whereas I think those other guys, now going down the list a little more, now the uncertainty becomes a lot to be drafting them as top 30, top 36 backs right away. I would prefer to get them as RB4s or draft them as RB4s, which means, 37th or later. So, and that could still happen for Walker or Spiller in some drafts. But I could just have a bias here, but I just think Hall is so good that he, like, the most RB needy team is probably going to overdraft him so they can use him like Najee. And like worst case scenario, maybe he's like in that Javonte mix with like another committee with another veteran, but I think he would still end up being better than that player by the end of the year. So I like Hall, don't like Walker and Spiller as much.
Yeah, I think it's realistic that he ends up kind of in that Javonte type role. Nashi Harris feels like such an anomaly to me, just because of sort of his landing spot and how bad the Steelers were in that workload that they ended up giving him. So yeah, to your point, like when I was drafting last year, I ended up with a bunch of guys like Michael Carter and Trey Sermon. So whatever, mixed bag there, but sort of in that like round 10, round 9 sort of range. So that's where I feel comfortable sort of loading up on those rookies. This just feels a little too early for me.
Yeah, and you got to really be selective. Like, for me, it's hard just because I like the talent, but at the end of the day, there's also going to be a guy like Elijah Mitchell, right? Who, there's usually one of those guys Robinson. Yeah, right. Like those guys that you can get much later. They don't necessarily have the draft pedigree, but they explode too. So it is smart to kind of load up on rookies, but that doesn't mean you load up on all the top rookies. That just means you kind of sprinkle them in throughout your draft. So, these top 3, I see where you're going, Samantha. It's like these top 3 are kind of the shiny new toys, and they're the ones getting a little overvalued. Whereas you kind of go down that list a little more, you might find some even more value. So yeah, definitely see your point on those guys. And that is going to wrap it up for the Fantasy Flex podcast, running back stock edition. As we go through March and early April leading up to the draft. We'll do wide receivers next week. We'll keep dropping these every week leading up to the draft, get you caught up on news, all that good stuff. You can follow Samantha on Twitter at Samantha NFL. You can follow me at Chris Raybon, Raybon. And be sure to check out actionnetwork.com for all of our fantasy and betting content, and fantasylabs.com for all of our DFS content, tools, and models. And as I mentioned, be sure to download that Action Network app if you like to bet on futures or games or whatever. You can track all your stuff. You can see our bets and all that good stuff. And if you like the show, give us a 5-star on Apple or Spotify. Until next time, let's get this money.